On the day of his wedding, Prince Kassardis was given 3 vessels of wine and 3 wives and 3 rings to gird his ring fingers. But Kassardis's heart was heavy at his wedding ceremony, and no amount of wine could float it up from the depths it had sunk to. For this ceremony held with it a deadly promise, for it was custom in that part that the prince, within a week of his wedding, should choose a favorite wife. This was a marker, a battle drum of sorts, between the 3 wives of the great house of Eumam. The battle only ended when one wife stood, scarred and bloody, and the remainder were dead or exiled. Kassardis was sick of this slaughter, and the hollow wreck of a man he called his father. His 3 wives were very pretty, but they were cruel as hawks. Even as he stood there beside the marriage pool, he could see the bloodlust glow behind their veiled eyes. It was for that reason he took his naming dagger and traveling cloak, and fled his tower one summer night. Vostoki was Prince Kassardis' first wife, and the youngest of them. She wore only 1 ring, and kept her fingernails expertly trimmed. Her dress was a short cut, her vela plain and good for traveling, and she wore eyeglasses. Her teeth were filed to points, and she kept sparrow feathers tucked behind her ear. She was a master marksman with the long rifle, with which she had trained her whole life, so that on her wedding day she could swiftly assassinate her rivals. By the time it had reached her wedding day, she had hunted 5 men in practice, and was thirsty for blood. It was for this reason she was the first to set out in search when the prince was found missing. Litari was Prince Kassardis' second wife, and though she was not quite as young and vigorous as his wife Vostoki, nor as patient and wise as his wife Presky, her bloodlust was the strongest by far. Where Vostoki was thin and lithe, and favored traveling clothes, Litari wore a full set of eidolon-wrought armor, which she cleaned and polished constantly, and gave her the appearance of a gargantuan demon. She was 12 spans tall, and had enormous teeth. Her bulging muscles meant tailoring for her was a nightmare for her maids, so she spurned their service, and preferred to travel with her cook, sandal-bearer, and sword-master only. Litari was far too strong to use a sword, for any normal weapon would break and shatter with the immense force she put on it. Instead, she dragged around with her a great and heavy iron cauldron, with which she would beat opponents to death quite savagely. It was this pot which the other princes' wives had promised to chain her and force her to serve as a scullery slave, and so she had taken an oath of revenge to pulp, cook, and eat them. Litari was by far the least popular of the prince's 3 wives, and so she only learned of his escape after the young Vostoki had started her pursuit. Nevertheless, by the 2nd day, she was not far behind her quarry, and her steps shook the dust from the eaves of peasant homes as she passed. Presky was Prince Kassardis' last and oldest wife, though barely by a few years. Despite her relative youth, however, her hair had already become white as snow. Some gossiped about how it was a curse from a vengeful sorcerer, for the offenses of the Princess Presky's family were broad, and no less horrible for their breadth. Presky kept her white hair long and bound up in coils that wrapped around her waist 5 times. She was exceedingly lazy, and would rather order one of her numerous and weary servants to fetch something than walk a mere 5 paces. She was pampered and fond of food and wine, and complained loudly if there was no place for her to lounge about. This laziness of hers was a clever mask, for Presky kept all her energy coiled up inside of her like a spring. She was a master swordswoman, in the old tradition of her family, and her muscles were like steel cables. Such was her skill that she could kill a man and sheath her sword before the first drop of his blood hit the ground. She had no need to pursue her opponents, for they could not touch her, and was instead content to wait until they came to their slaughter. This was the source and secret of her arrogance. She loudly mocked Kassardis' other wives, especially the large and slow Litari, for she believed there was no chance they could beat her in open combat, and it was true. It was only fitting, therefore, that the languid Presky was the last to set out in pursuit of the young prince and her palanquin, with her full retinue trailing after her. Prince Kassardis knew his 3 wives were cunning and vicious in equal measure, and the journey ahead would be hard and grueling. Therefore, the very first thing he did was to seek out the very wise frog, which lived on a nearby hill known as King's Rock. The road to the frog was well worn by pilgrims, so it was not a hard climb for Kassardis, who wore his fine leather boots, but it was steep. "Very wise frog," said Kassardis when he reached the summit, "this brutal life is like a steel cage. My father's kingdom is built on the stacked bodies of his officers. He sups on blood. His surviving wife picks his gray hairs and pushes toy soldiers around from her sedan." "Your father's kingdom is very large," said the very wise frog. "I will escape my own blood," said the resolute Kassardis, "and flee to the land of Samura, where their cities are built on covenants of peace and no blood is shed unjustly. The journey is long and hard, so please give me some advice, as my family has treated you well." "Samura is a myth told to small children to comfort them," said the very wise frog. "Your wives are much faster than you and will catch up to you, then beat you savagely before returning to the time-honored ritual of trying to murder each other." The prince was aghast. "I refuse this life of violence," he said. "Violence is inescapable," said the very wise frog. "Don't gloat at me, frog," said the prince. "My trial is only just beginning. Surely you have some other advice for me." "No," said the very wise frog. "Frog," said Kassardis, growing panicked, "what do you mean by violence is inescapable?" "It is," said the frog. "You're a liar," said Kassardis. "No, I am not," said the frog, "nor have I ever been. Violence is inescapable, inseparable from life itself, permanent. It is fixed in your cosmology forever. I could go on, but that's beside the point." At this, Kassardis was so enraged that he threw the frog off the summit of the mountain. It bounced off a cliff and split like a wet melon, dying instantly, and posthumously proving its point to Kassardis. Kassardis, for his part, wept. Prince Kassardis was swift, and he was young and his mind was honed. The land about his kingdom was barren but not fierce, and the roads were well kept. Even so, the sun had barely dipped below the horizon before he knew he would soon be caught. For as he glanced back over his shoulder, he saw the cruel glint on Vostoki's eyeglasses as she traversed the bluffs behind him. And a little further back from that, even for all this distance, he thought he could hear the awful grinding of Latari's cauldron as she dragged it across the bare earth. And even further back, just cresting the horizon, were the bright and lazy banners of Apreski, as her palanquin was borne into the desert. Prince Kassardis struggled mightily to rid himself of his pursuers, for despite what the very wise frog had told him, he still held within his heart the vain hope that the peaceful land of Samura existed, and he would some day find himself upon its gleaming shores, free of his wives and his throne. First, he fled the road, and spying a low and reeking gully, hurled himself therein. There the mud and brambles were so thick that he could barely move, and the fetid water was choked with the corpses of animals that had become trapped in the muck. Thick clouds of flies bit at Kassardis as he struggled heroically onward, until at last he heaved himself from the mud, his trail almost completely invisible, and made for higher ground. Indeed, when the clever and keen Vostoki came upon Kassardis's trail disappearing into the gully, she was taken aback by his cleverness. But with her specially made eyeglasses, Vostoki's eyesight was keener than a hawk's. She picked out the shining pieces of thread from Kassardis' silver waistcoat clinging to the brambles, and was back on his trail in scarcely an hour, her fellow wives close behind. Seeing his 3 wives draw ever closer, and that his first plot to foil them had failed miserably, Prince Kassardis doubled his pace. Knowing he would never outrun the cruel Vostoki on open ground, he hurled himself into a sea of dead grass, and used up all his water trying to escape her grasp. A night and a day later, he emerged on the shores of the river Dal, and spent the last of his money hiring a fisherman to take him downriver. The fisherman's boat overturned in the town of Kolvaris, and there Kassardis did a very shameful thing. He sold to the first rich man he could find his fine silk head wrap, and his father's silver dagger, and his waistcoat lined with sparrow feathers, which were marks of his lineage. With his sack of foreign coin he hired 6 strong men, belligerent knights from the wars of conquest, and hid himself in a wheelbarrow, hoping against hope that his ploy would be enough. Vestoki arrived in the dusty town not hours later, and she was almost immediately set upon by the mercenaries that Kassardis had hired. From his hiding place, the young prince watched as Vestoki was caught in their ambush and fought desperately against stave and sword. Vestoki was very fast, but also very slight, and no match against the 6 knights in close combat. Though beaten, she merely retreated to lick her wounds and set camp outside of town. One of the knights nearly lost his head to her long rifle when he ventured out to confront her, and that was that, for a while. As night fell, the knights returned to Kassardis. "Where wandereth thee, young one?" they said, in their foreign dialects. "To the land of Samura, where I may find peace and an escape from violence," said the exhausted Kassardis from his hiding place. "Violence is inescapable," guffawed the mercenaries, and robbed Kassardis of everything remaining that he owned, for they had seen that he was a fool from the start. They threw him naked and beaten into the street, and spent their winnings on drink. Kassardis, his swollen eyes full of tears, and knowing his time was short, stole a woman's garb from a washing line and a small hunk of bread, and fled into the desert, the final words of the very wise frog echoing in his ears. The belligerent knights, for their part, died not hours later when they were squashed into a pulp by Latari's iron cauldron. Kassardis knew his time was running short as he fled into the wastes around the town of Colveris. Instead of his naming knife, he had a stale hunk of bread, and instead of his prince's garb, he had only a stolen woman's garment, thin and nearly useless against the freezing cold of the desert nights. He knew his 3 wives were not far behind, and despair was his constant companion, but still he pushed on, wholly consumed with the conviction that he would find the peaceful land of Samura, or die in the process. By the 3rd day, when the desperate prince's wives were closing in rapidly, the scorched and tortured soles of Kassardis's feet felt stone and not sand beneath them. Kassardis looked up and saw that he had stumbled upon a mighty road, broad and sweeping, that passed through enormous stone arches into the distance. The road was crumbled with age, but Kassardis recognized at once that it was the famous arched road of Samura, and a great burst of hope filled his heart. Kassardis followed the road until it was dark, and lightness filled his steps so that he did not even notice when the sun had gone and the nightmare chill of the desert began to grasp at him. All through the night he followed the road, and the night itself could not touch him. And when the sun grazed his face, Kassardis was still walking, but he still had not found the kingdom of Samura. It remained like this for a day longer, until Kassardis, sustained by hope alone and dying of thirst, stumbled across a battered old sword-master, encamped by the side of the road. The sword-master was aghast at Kassardis's dreadful condition, and at once tended to him and gave him water. "Young man," said the old sword-master, "I am Ket Amanket, the gatekeeper of the kingdom of Samura. There is nothing for you here. Turn back." Kassardis was shocked. "Uncle," he gasped, "if you are indeed the gatekeeper of that mighty kingdom, please take me there at once. I am fleeing from my 3 wives, who wish to drag me back into a world of bloody tyranny." "You are here already," said Ket Amanket, and motioned to the desert. "This is the kingdom of Samura, burned to ashes and ground into dust for decades." Mortified, Kassardis could only gape at the empty desert. But here and there the young prince could see what he had been blind to while hope had still filled him up. The corroded remnants of great and stately buildings and fluted columns poking out of the desert like bleached ribs. "Samura was founded on the principles of peace," said Ket Amanket, "so it was sought out by many across all the 10,000 realms. Those that sought to flee from the world of violence." "Violence is inescapable," moaned Kassardis. "Yes," said the old man, "very wise words indeed. Soon this land contained more people than it could sustain. Violence once again began to grow in the heart of its people, like a foul disease, until it blossomed into destruction. It was a foolish hope." "Then there is no hope for me," said Kassardis. "There is still yet," said Ket-Amanket, resolute. "Let me do one favor for you, young man, as one who has already lived too long. You must flee to the canyon south of here and hide yourself there as best you can until the sun sets. I will tell your wives you vanished into the desert a day past, and throw them off your trail." "Thank you, uncle," said Kassardis. "I will hold on to my hope for a little while longer." "Hold on to this," said Ket-Amanket, giving Kassardis his sword. "It will protect you a lot better than hope." Kassardis took the weapon very reluctantly, and would have thrown it away at the first chance he had, but the words of the very wise frog continued to tear at his mind, so he clung on to it as he fled for the canyon. "At the very least, I'll give the boy a good head start," Ket-Amanket assured himself as he watched Kassardis's 3 wives trek over the dunes a little while later. The sword-master was wrong. Ipresky severed his windpipe before he could get a single word out, and all that passed his lips was a spray of blood. Kassardis got a head start of about 10 minutes. Kassardis, for his part, could do little but flee to the canyon, carrying the old sword-master's weapon and clad in near rags. Once there, he hid himself among the reeds in a low pool in the bottom of the canyon. It was cool and shady there, and the coming evening began to wash over the land, and Kassardis felt, for the first time in days, peace enter his heart. It was with dread, then, that he heard the footfalls of his 3 wives entering the canyon not an hour later, and knew that his time had run out. Kassardis knew instantaneously that the words of the very wise frog had come true, for the canyon had 3 entrances, and down each came one of his wives, armed and thirsty for blood. First, small and cunning Vestoki, with the glint of her rifle sights, then enormous and brutal Litari, dragging her iron cauldron, and finally the refined Ipresky, languid and resplendent on her palanquin. And one after the other, all 3 of their cruel and lusty eyes fell upon Kassardis. Kassardis tried to pray, but found no sound would come out of his lungs. He tried to hide deeper in the reeds, but he found the mud unyielding. He tried to shut his eyes, but his heartbeat drowned out his thoughts. So instead, he clutched onto the sword-master's weapon like a good luck charm, its cruel metal cold against his bare chest. A strange thought entered his mind and gripped his tendons like a vice. And as this thought gripped Kassardis, it was then that the truth of the very wise frog revealed itself in its full glory. For violence truly was inescapable, and the 3 wives were inundated with it. They had no other language with which to negotiate their hard-won spoils.
"Stand aside," said soft Ipresky. "As oldest wife, the silver prince is mine by right." "Move an inch further," said Vestoki, "and I will put a bullet through that milky throat."
Litari, for her part, said nothing, but rather hefted her cauldron to the air with a tremendous roar and charged. Kassardis watched as the words of the very wise frog came perfectly true, and a brutal combat unfolded. Realizing the danger that Vestoki's rifle presented, Ipresky slid off her palanquin and behind an enormous boulder, but that boulder was shattered a moment later by the tremendous force of Litari's iron cauldron, sending her flying. Ipresky's servants and retainers were pulped a moment later against the heavy bottom of the cauldron, and spread across the rock, and Litari advanced on the eldest wife, frothing at the mouth. She would have crushed Ipresky as she promised, but in a mere second there were 3 cracks of Vestoki's rifle, and Litari's skull blossomed in gore, her cauldron smashing to the rocks below as she slumped forward. Ipresky sprang to her feet, her fine silks tearing, and drew her blade, dashing at Vestoki before she could reload. Vestoki was impossibly agile, and even though her fingers were slick with grit and sweat, she chambered around and fired it right at the smooth face of the eldest wife. But Ipresky had anticipated this for years, and had practiced a blade art specifically for this purpose, which she called the ego ballistics. With impossible speed, she cut through possibility and cleft the bullet in 2 before it could touch her flesh. Vestoki was taken aback.
Such was her speed, however, that the incoming blow merely severed her nose from her face and cleft her glasses in two, instead of separating her head from her shoulders, as was intended. Blinded by gouts of blood and shrieking in pain, she crawled away, but Epresci, caught in the moment of victory, was blinded in her own way to Latari, who had survived 3 bullets to the head by the virtue of her enormously thick skull, and was now staggering up behind her with cauldron in hand. The first blow of the cauldron cracked Epresci's back and sent her sprawling. The second crushed her shins and feet to splinters. The third did not come, for Vestoki, acting on instinct, loosed 3 more shots, which blew the throat out from Latari and sent her reeling backwards. This gory sight, and the ruin of his 3 wives, Kassardis beheld, and his resolve hardened into ice. He emerged from the pool, his blood cold in his veins, and the old sword-master's blade clutched tight in his hand. As Kassardis approached his maimed and mangled wives, they scrabbled for their weapons in whatever way they could, clutching their gory injuries. For Kassardis was a ghastly sight, malnourished, clad only in rags, and with a terrible light in his eyes. They should have known then that the fate Kassardis had chosen for them was far worse than they could have ever expected, but they were fools with little imagination, and so chose to fight anyway. Kassardis took the pommel of his blade, and with all his strength struck each of the wives across the head, knocking them unconscious. It took 4 blows from the great enameled hilt of the sword to fell Latari, but eventually the pints of blood she had lost stopped her struggle. With great fierceness, Kassardis drove off Epresci's retainers, and tearing scraps of cloth, bound the gushing wounds of his wives however he could. He knew, however dire their injuries seemed, they would likely survive, having been bred for generations for thick blood, tough skin, and other valuable traits to place them above his potential wives. Exhausted, the Silver Prince finally dragged himself to the road, where he waited for a merchant's cart, and went to a hard-scrabble town to find an apothecary. There he bartered the remains of the old swordmaster's belongings for medicine, keeping only the blade and the old man's boots, which he put on. Finally, there in the gulch, Kassardis made camp, and over the next few days tended to his wives with incredible care. He sewed up gashes, blotted dried blood, and fed them water as they suffered. And though he tried his best, Latari would surely never speak again, Epresci surely never walk again, and Vestoki's nose had long since disappeared into a pond. On the 3rd day, Vestoki, the youngest and most calculating, could finally speak, and when she did, she was astonished.
"You fool," she croaked. "Do you seek to garner my sympathy? When I am well again, I will subdue you, husband, and take you back to our great kingdom and our rightful throne. This changes nothing."
"Of course," said Kassardis. "Violence is inescapable. The very wise frog was right." And to Vestoki, something had changed in Kassardis. He was more relaxed and more tense at the same time, like flexible steel. A great truth had settled into his flesh, and his calm was a terrible thing to behold. "I came to find the land of Samura, where peace is eternal," said Kassardis, "but instead I find that I must carry Samura with me." And he grasped the hilt of his sword and stood, and Vestoki finally realized how tall he was. "None of the 3 of you will ever agree to share me, and none of the 3 of you can best the other," said Kassardis. "You are already too poisoned by violence. I will run from you, and you will find me again and again, and again and again you will destroy yourselves in trying to claim me, and again I will tend to your wounds and flee, knowing that I will never truly escape. Again and again you will destroy yourselves until you are mere hunks of flesh, crippled wrecks of meat, and there will come a day when you have become so ruined that even I will be able to best you in combat, and you will submit to my peace." Vestoki did not believe Kassardis at first, for she was a fool, but she humored him anyway. "And what then?" she scoffed. "Your kingdom, my silver prince, will ever await you. It is worth 100,000 cattle and 500,000 sheep. They will send more wives, 10,000 of them." and I will tend to them too," said Kassardis.
It was then that Vostoki knew the truth of Kassardis's words, but she could do nothing about it, for violence was inescapable. She knew she could not turn from her fate, for the vain hope that she would still win grasped her beyond all reason. "You will never rest," she spat, and her missing nose wept blood. "You will flee for all eternity."
"Such is the cost of peace," said Kassardis, "even if I should care for 10,000 maimed wives."
Then he tightened his wife's bandages, and soothed the struggling Vostoki, and left them ample supplies, and though his wives spat and cursed at him, they could do little but let him leave, his countenance calm and resolute, as he said one last thing. "I will see you in Samura."